The morning I signed the papers on my lake house, I poured myself a glass of sweet tea, sat down on the back porch and just listened to the water. No phone calls, no one needing anything from me. Just the sound of the dock creaking in the wind and a couple of mallards cutting across the surface of Lake Norman. I was 63 years old. I had 4 bedrooms, a 2-car garage, and a net worth I never could have imagined back when I was driving a delivery truck for a wholesale lumber company in Greensboro. I had nobody to share it with, which used to bother me. That afternoon, it felt like the most peaceful thing in the world. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest of this story. I am not a man who chases drama. I never was. I spent 40 years getting up before sunrise, doing the work, keeping my head down. I raised my daughter the best I could after her mother passed. I built a small landscaping business out of a rusted trailer and 2 used mowers, and I grew it into something real. When I sold the company at 61, I walked away with enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life, and then some. That part of the story is not the point. The point is what happened after. My daughter's name is Stephanie. She is 40 years old now. She was 23 when she met her husband, a man named Bradley, at some marketing conference in Charlotte. He had good teeth, an expensive watch, and a way of talking that made everything sound like a business deal. I tried to like him. I did like him for a while. But something about the way he looked at my house on Sundays, counting the square footage with his eyes, always made the back of my neck go tight. Stephanie and I had a falling out when my grandson Kyle was about 3. I will not pretend it was entirely her fault. I said things I should not have said about Bradley. She said things she should not have said about me. But what came after was not a mutual cooling off. What came after was Bradley. He worked on her steady and quiet, the way water works on limestone, and inside of 6 months, I went from Sunday dinners to no returned phone calls. Then he had their number changed. Then they moved from Concord to somewhere outside of Raleigh and did not tell me the new address. Kyle was 3 years old. I missed his 4th birthday, his 5th, his 6th. I sent cards to their old address for 2 years before I stopped. I do not know if he ever got a single one. I grieved that loss the way you grieve a death, except worse, because the people were still alive and had simply decided you were not worth the trouble. I went through a year that I am not proud of, drank more than I should have. Let the yard go. My friend Harold, who had worked with me since the early days of the business, used to stop by on Saturday mornings and make sure I ate something. Then one morning I woke up and decided I was done grieving. I sold the company 2 years later, not because of the money, though the money was real. I sold it because I had built something from nothing and I wanted to see what else I could build. I took a real estate licensing course at 58, which my accountant thought was insane. I focused on commercial properties, learned the market, made some smart acquisitions in the Mooresville corridor right before the development wave hit. By the time I was 62, I had done well enough that the word comfortable did not quite cover it anymore. The lake house was 3,000 square feet, 4 bedrooms, a wraparound deck over the water. I had a neighbor named George who brought over a bottle of bourbon when I moved in and asked me nothing about my past. That suited me just fine. I had been at Lake Norman for about 18 months when my cell phone rang with an unknown North Carolina number. I almost did not pick up. I had a policy about unknown numbers by then. But something made me answer. Dad. I had not heard that voice in 11 years. I sat down on the kitchen stool without deciding to. Stephanie. She started crying before I could say anything else. Not dramatic, ugly crying. Quiet crying, which in my experience is worse. She said she was sorry. She said Bradley had made things very hard. She said she had been thinking about me for a long time and she missed me and she needed to talk to me. I am not made of stone. Nobody is, not really, Not when it is their own child on the other end of the line. We talked for an hour. I did not promise anything. I did not invite her over, but I told her I would think about things, and I meant it. When I hung up, I sat with my coffee gone cold and thought about Kyle, who was now 14, and whether he even remembered me at all. 3 days later, she called again. This time Bradley was on the line too. He was warm in the way salespeople are warm, smooth. He talked about the past like it was weather that had happened to all of us equally. He said the family had been going through changes. He said Stephanie had really been struggling with the distance. He said he hoped there were no hard feelings on either side. I noticed he did not say he was sorry, but I listened. I asked about Kyle. Bradley said Kyle was a great kid, real sharp, already talking about college. Something in my chest loosened when he said that. "We'd love to come see the new place," Bradley said near the end of the call. "Maybe next weekend, if you're open to it." I said I would think about it and call them back. I called Harold that evening. Harold has known me for 30 years and has never once told me what I wanted to hear when what I wanted to hear was wrong. "You're going to let them in," he said. "I might. Just go slow, Eugene. That's all I'll say. Go slow. My name is Eugene, by the way. Eugene Marsh. I spent most of my life going by Gene, but I use the full name now. It suits where I've ended up." I called Stephanie back and told her they could come for lunch the following Saturday. I spent the week telling myself I was just being open-minded, that people change, that Bradley may have been different now, that Kyle deserved to know his grandfather. I believed most of it. They arrived 40 minutes late. Stephanie looked tired in a way that went beyond just that morning. She hugged me at the door and held on a second too long, which told me things were harder at home than she was letting on. Kyle came in behind her, 6 feet tall now, a quiet kid with his mother's eyes and his father's posture, like he had learned early to take up as little space as possible. He shook my hand. His grip was firm. I liked him immediately and felt a pain behind my ribs about all the years between us. Bradley came in last, looking at the house the same way he had always looked at things that were not his, but that he thought should be. "Gene, this place is something else," he said. "How much land you sitting on? Not hello. Not good to see you. How much land?" I told him. He nodded like he was filing it away. Lunch went fine on the surface. Stephanie helped me with the food, and we talked carefully around everything that mattered. Kyle asked me about the boats on the water, and I told him I had a small fishing boat, and he could use it whenever he wanted. His face opened up in a way that nearly broke me. This kid had been 3 years old the last time I held him. Now he was taller than me, and he smiled at the idea of fishing like it was something he had not been offered enough of. Bradley spent most of lunch on his phone. When he put it down, he talked about a commercial real estate deal he was working on in the Research Triangle. Big numbers, big opportunity. He looked at me when he said the numbers. After dessert, when Kyle had gone down to the dock, Bradley leaned back in his chair and said, "We've actually been thinking about making some changes. Housing market where we are has gotten brutal. And with Kyle getting older, it might be good for him to be around family." I kept my face still. Stephanie did not look at me when he said it. "There's obviously plenty of room here," Bradley continued. 4 bedrooms is a lot for one person. We figured maybe a temporary arrangement while we get our footing. There it was. I took a sip of my iced tea. I said I would need some time to think about it. Bradley looked surprised, like the answer should have been yes before he finished the sentence. Stephanie finally looked at me, and in her eyes I saw something I recognized from when she was a little girl, asking for something she knew might be a no, but behind that, something else. Something I could not quite name right away. On the drive home from dropping them off, I had offered to show them around the area. I called Harold from the car. "They asked to move in," I said. Harold was quiet for a moment. On the first visit. On the first visit. Eugene. He only used my full name when he was serious. You need to make some calls. I spent the following week doing exactly that. I called my accountant, a sharp woman named Beverly, who had managed my books for 12 years. I called my attorney, a man named Frank, who had handled my business sale and knew every line of my finances. I told them both what had happened and asked them to dig around quietly. Beverly called me back on Wednesday. She had found, through some routine cross-checking, that Bradley's commercial deal in the Research Triangle had collapsed 8 months ago. He had personally guaranteed part of the debt. There were 2 civil judgments against him. The house in Raleigh had a second mortgage that was 90 days behind. I sat with that for a long time. Then I thought about Kyle, down at the end of that dock, smiling at the water. I decided I was going to play this differently. I called Stephanie and told her they were welcome to come back the following weekend, that I was open to talking about the living arrangement. She sounded so relieved, it almost hurt. What I did not tell her was that I had already spoken to Frank about updating my property documents. I did not tell her I had a conversation with my neighbor George, who was a retired county deputy, about what certain behaviors look like legally. I did not tell her I had started keeping notes. They came back the next Saturday with 3 suitcases. I had not said yes yet, but they brought suitcases. Bradley walked in and started talking about which bedroom would be his home office. Stephanie moved into the kitchen and began rearranging my cabinets without asking. Kyle stood in the hallway looking at the floor, and when I caught his eye, he gave me a look that was not the look of a kid on a fun trip to Grandpa's lake house. It was the look of a kid who had seen this routine before and knew how it ended. I brought him down to the fishing boat that afternoon and let Bradley and Stephanie have their conversation with the walls. Out on the water, with the engine off and the afternoon quiet around us, Kyle said, "Grandpa, you don't have to let us stay." I looked at him. "Why would you say that?" He shrugged, picking at a thread on his life vest. "I just know how my dad is. Tell me about your dad." He was quiet for a while. Then, slowly, he told me about the debt, about the fighting, about the night 2 months ago when he had heard Bradley on the phone in the garage talking to someone about the old man's lake property and what it was worth if it ever went to sale. About a name he had heard, a name I did not recognize that Bradley had mentioned in connection with money he owed. My hands were steady on the fishing rod. Inside, something cold and very clear had settled. I asked Kyle if he would be willing to tell me more over the next few days. He said yes. I told him that whatever happened, he was going to be okay. I meant it with everything I had. That night after dinner, Bradley raised the subject of formalizing the arrangement. He had actually typed something up on his phone, a kind of outline, points about shared expenses and how the property would be jointly managed. He read it out loud at my kitchen table like we were in a boardroom. I listened to every word. Then I said I was tired and would think about it in the morning. Over the next 10 days, I let them settle in just enough. Bradley set up his computer in the guest room and started taking calls. Stephanie cooked and cleaned and seemed genuinely happy for the first time, which made everything harder and clearer at the same time. Kyle started talking to me at breakfast. He asked about the business, asked about real estate, asked about what I had learned from building something from nothing. He was a smart, hungry kid, and every morning I thought about who he might become if someone gave him a real foundation. On day 11, I made 3 phone calls, one to Frank, one to Beverly, one to a woman I had been introduced to through George, a social worker who specialized in teen welfare and family situations. On day 14, I told Stephanie I was having a few people over for dinner Saturday evening, some old friends, and I'd love for them to join us. She seemed pleased. Bradley nodded like it was a social obligation he would manage. Saturday came. Harold drove up from Greensboro. Beverly came with her husband. Frank came with his wife. George came from next door. My old friend Dale, who had been my first employee 30 years ago, drove 3 hours from Asheville because I asked him to. Bradley had put on a blazer. He worked the room for the first 20 minutes like a man auditioning for something. After dinner, when everyone was settled with their coffee and the sun was going down over the water, I stood up. I thanked everyone for coming. I said I had something I needed to share. I laid it out calmly. The judgments against Bradley, the second mortgage, the calls about my property, what Kyle had told me on the boat, with Kyle present and nodding at the table, which cost that boy more than I could say and which I will be grateful for until the day I die. The document Bradley had typed up, which Frank had reviewed and described as, in his precise legal phrasing, an attempt to establish informal co-ownership rights. Bradley's face went through several colors. He started to talk about how things had been taken out of context, about how family was supposed to support each other, about how I was embarrassing Stephanie in front of her father's friends. I let him finish. Then I said, "Bradley, I spent 11 years without my daughter and my grandson because of choices you made. I spent those years building something you thought you could walk into and take a piece of. I want you to know that every door in this house and everything behind it will remain mine." He stood up, said some things not worth repeating. Frank slid a document across the table, a formal notice prepared in advance. Frank explained it briefly and clearly. George, who had said nothing all evening, stood up from his chair when Bradley raised his voice, which was enough. Bradley looked around the room at people who had known me for decades and understood, perhaps for the first time, that he had badly miscalculated. Stephanie sat very still through all of it. When it was over, when Bradley had gone out to the car, she looked at me with tears running down her face, and she said, "Dad, I'm so sorry." I believed her. I still do. I told her she was welcome in this house, that she had a place here if she wanted to do the hard work of rebuilding something real, that Kyle had a grandfather who was not going anywhere. I told her that Bradley, as long as he was living the way he was living, did not. She sat with that for a long time. I did not rush her. I do not know yet what she will choose. She left with him that night, which I understood. 11 years of a marriage does not dissolve in one dinner, even a dinner like that one. We have talked twice on the phone since then. The conversations have been careful and real and nothing like the performances of that first Saturday. Kyle texted me the Monday after. He said, "Thanks for not pretending, Grandpa." I read it about 6 times, standing in my kitchen in the morning light. He is coming up to the lake in July. Just him. We are going to fish, and I'm going to tell him everything I know about building something from nothing, about what it costs and what it gives back, about how the people who underestimate you are doing you a favor because they stop paying attention, about how the most powerful thing a man can do is simply outlast the people who counted him out. He can start with part-time work if he wants. I know people. I know the market. I know what it takes. What I know most of all is that the best thing I ever built was not a business. It was not a balance sheet or a piece of lake property. It was the patience to wait until I could do this right. The mallards are back this morning, same 2 I saw on the day I signed the papers. I have my sweet tea. The dock is still creaking. I am exactly where I am supposed to be. I have thought a lot about what actually happened at that dinner table. Not the drama of it, not Bradley's face going through colors, not the way Frank slid that document across the wood like something final. What I keep coming back to is Kyle, sitting there at 14 years old, nodding at the truth he had already told me out on the water. That took more courage than anything I did that evening. I had decades of experience and a room full of people behind me. He had nothing but the decision to stop pretending. That is what I mean when I say the consequences we face are almost always the ones we built ourselves, brick by brick over time. Bradley did not end up sitting across from a retired man's attorney because of bad luck. He spent years making small choices, treating people as assets, using a child as emotional leverage, calculating square footage instead of saying hello. And each one of those choices was a brick. By the time he walked into my lake house with his blazer and his phone full of figures, the wall was already built. He just could not see it yet. And I was not innocent of this either. I let years go by in grief when I could have fought harder. There were probably moments early on where a different choice from me might have changed the road entirely. I do not say that to punish myself. I say it because I think it matters to be honest about the whole picture, not just the satisfying ending. What pulled me through the 11 years was not bitterness, even when it felt like bitterness. It was work. It was getting up and building something real with my hands and my judgment, day after day, when I had no particular reason to believe it would amount to anything. That is what I mean by character. Not the dramatic moment, but the 10,000 ordinary mornings before it. You do not develop the clarity to see through someone like Bradley in one conversation. You develop it over a lifetime of learning what actually holds and what only looks like it does. The smartest thing I ever did was stay curious. I kept learning the market past 60. I asked Beverly questions I probably should have known the answers to already. I listened to Harold when I did not want to. Staying a student of your own life, that is not a small thing. That is how you stay sharp enough to protect what you build and the people you love. Kyle texting me that Monday, saying thanks for not pretending. I will carry that with me. Because what he was really saying was that he had been surrounded by pretending for a long time and he recognized the difference. Kids always do, they just usually do not have anyone standing firm enough to show them what the alternative looks like. I cannot tell you what Stephanie will choose. I hope she finds her way back. I believe she will. But I know that whatever happens, Kyle has seen something real now. He has seen that a man can be knocked down, can lose years, can grieve quietly, and still come out standing on solid ground. That you do not have to grab at other people's things to feel like you matter. That patience and honesty over a long enough stretch are more powerful than any scheme. That is the only inheritance worth leaving.